3. Soviet citizens were quick to protest against material shortages and inequalities. They wrote in their thousands to the government to complain about corruption and inefficiencies, which they linked to the privileges of the new bureaucracy. Yet, at the same time, there were many citizens who persevered in the expectation that they would live to see the communist utopia. The Soviet regime was sustained by this idea in the 1930s. Millions of people were persuaded to believe that the hardships of their daily lives were a necessary sacrifice for the building of a communist society. Hard work today would be rewarded tomorrow, when the Soviet good life would be enjoyed by all. In Ideology and Utopia, 1929, the German sociologist Karl Mannheim discussed the tendency of revolutionary Marxists to experience time as a series of strategical points along a path to a future paradise, which they perceive as real and tangible. Because this future is a factor in the present and defines the course of history, it gives meaning to everyday realities. In the Soviet Union, this idea of time had its origins in the utopian projections of the 1917 revolution. For the Bolsheviks, October 1917 was the beginning of year one in a new history of humanity, just as 1789 marked the start of the new world created by the Jacobins. Projecting the present into the future, Soviet propaganda portrayed the revolution moving forwards on the march of history towards the communist utopia. It hailed the achievements of the 5-year plans as proof that this utopia was just over the horizon. The 5-year plans played a crucial role in this utopian projection. The conception of the plan was to accelerate the arrival of the socialist future by speeding up the tempo of the whole economy. Hence the slogan, the 5-year plan in 4. Indeed, the plan was to conquer time itself by subordinating it to the proletarian will. In the capitalist economies of the West, work was organized according to a strictly rational division of time. But in the Soviet Union, work was structured according to the goals set by the 5-year plans. Because the achievement of this goal was always imminent, it made sense to storm production, to work for a brief but frenzied spell to reach that goal when it would be possible to rest. The Stalinist economy was based on this storming of production to meet the 5-year plans, just as the system as a whole was based on the idea that present hardship would be rewarded in the communist utopia. Nikolai Patolichev, a Vidvishinets of the first 5-year plan, who later rose to the party's senior ranks, remembers, "We Soviet people consciously denied ourselves a lot. We said to ourselves, today we don't have things that we really need. Well, so what? We shall have them tomorrow." That was the power of our belief in the party's cause. Young people of my generation were happy in this belief. Looking back on the 1930s, many people recall a sense of living for the future rather than for the present. The feeling was particularly strong in the generation that had grown up since 1917, young people like Patolichev who were totally immersed in the values and ideals of the Soviet regime. For this generation, the communist utopia was not a distant dream, but a tangible reality, just around the corner and soon to arrive. Soviet schoolchildren in the 1920s and 1930s imagined communism as a transformation of their own immediate reality, cows full of milk, busy factories, rather than in far-off science fiction terms. That was how they had been brought up to regard the Soviet future by Soviet propaganda and by socialist realist literature and art. Socialist realism, as officially defined at the first Congress of the Writers' Union in 1934, entailed the truthful, historically concrete representation of reality in its revolutionary development. The artist's role was to portray the world not as it was in the present, but as it would become, and was becoming, in the communist future. According to Lyudmila Yelyasheva, born in 1921, and her sister Marksena, 1923, this conception of the communist utopia was widely shared by their friends at school in Leningrad. We were all educated in the expectation of a happy future. I remember when my sister broke our favourite porcelain doll. We did not have the money to buy another doll, but we went to the department store where there were dolls on display, and Marksena said, "When there is communism, we shall have that doll." We pictured communism as a time, which we would live to see, when everything would be free and everyone would have the happiest life imaginable. We were glad to be waiting for this beautiful future. Raisa Orlova, who grew up in Moscow in the 1930s, recalls the sense of hurtling towards the future. It made the present seem unreal. I had an unshakable conviction that my existence between these old walls, the apartment on Tverskaya Street in Moscow where she grew up, was merely a preparation for the real life to come. That life would start in a new and sparkling white house. There I would do exercises in the morning. There the ideal order would reign. There all my heroic achievements would commence. The majority of my contemporaries, whether they lived in tents, dugouts, communal flats, or what were then considered luxurious private apartments, shared the same kind of provisional, rough and ready approach to life. Faster, faster, towards the great goal, towards the new life. Everything could and should be changed. The streets, the houses, the cities, the social order, human souls. And it didn't seem all that difficult. First, the enthusiasts would outline the plan on paper. Then they would tear down the old. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Then they would clear the rubble, and in the space that had been cleared, they would erect the edifice of the socialist dream. That's how Russia was being reconstructed. We thought it was possible to do the same with people. Moscow was the building site of this utopia. In the imagination of the communists, where soon and now were all confused, Moscow had a legendary status and significance as a symbol of the socialist utopia that was under construction. In this city of fantastic dreams and illusions, a foundation pit was a future housing block. The demolition of a church signalled the appearance of a palace of culture. The German communist, Wolfgang Leonhardt, who arrived in Moscow with his parents in 1935, describes their confusion when they sought to replace their outdated 1924 map. The new map showed all the improvements which, according to the master plan, were destined for completion by 1945. "We used to take both town plans with us on our walks," Leonhardt writes, one showing what Moscow had looked like 10 years before, the other showing what it would look like 10 years hence. The speed of change in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s was intoxicating. The illusion that a new world was being created led many people, including a large number of socialist intellectuals in the West, to delude themselves about the Stalinist regime. Nina Kaminskaya, a young law student, continued to believe in the new world even after her father was sacked from his job in a Soviet bank and evidence of a darker reality was mounting. In her memoirs, she remembers a song she and her friends would sing, a song of joy at the happy life to come, which symbolized the optimism of their generation and their blindness to the tragedy which their parents were already going through. Believing in our country is so easy. Breathing in our country is so free. Our glorious, beloved Soviet land, our Soviet life is so good and bright that children in ages to come will probably cry in their beds at night because they were not born in our lifetime. Members of the Soviet intelligentsia were so swept up by this optimistic atmosphere that they closed their eyes to the horrors perpetrated by the Stalinist regime in the name of progress. Boris Pasternak wrote to Olga Freidenberg in April 1935, "The fact is, the longer I live, the more firmly I believe in what is being done. despite everything. Much of it strikes one as being savage, yet the people have never before looked so far ahead, and with such a sense of self-esteem, and with such fine motives, and for such vital and clear-headed reasons. Nadezhda Mandelstam recalls how she and her husband, the poet Osip Mandelstam, were also sometimes drawn to think this way, fearing momentarily that the revolution would pass them by if they failed to notice all the great things happening before our eyes. Osip was arrested in 1934 after he had read out to his friends his seditious poem about Stalin, the murderer and peasant slayer. As Nadezhda Mandelstam observed, it was easier to believe in what was being done for the communist utopia than to insist, as her husband had, on confronting reality. A man who knew that you cannot build the present out of the bricks of the future was bound to resign himself beforehand to his inevitable doom and the prospect of the firing squad. To accept this vision of the future entailed adopting certain attitudes that smoothed the way to collusion with the regime. It meant the acceptance of the party as the source of truth. For many people, this belief involved a constant struggle between the observed truth of existing reality and the higher, revolutionary truth of the party. They were forced to live in the margins between these two truths, to acknowledge the failures of the Soviet system while still believing in the promise of a better life to come, something they could only accomplish through a conscious act of political faith. Lev Kopyalev, a young communist who took part in some of the worst excesses against the kulaks in 1932-3, recalls his efforts to subordinate his moral judgment, what he called subjective truth, to the higher moral goals, objective truth, of the party. Kopyalev and his comrades were horrified by what they were doing to the peasantry, but they deferred to the party. The prospect of retreating from this position on the basis of what they had been brought up to dismiss as the bourgeois ideals of conscience, honor, and humanitarianism filled them with dread. "What we feared most," recalls Kopyalev, "was to lose our heads, to fall into doubt or heresy, and forfeit our unbounded faith." Wolfgang Leonhardt was similarly conscious of a dual reality. By the time he joined the Komsomol, he had long since realized that reality in the Soviet Union was completely different from the picture presented in Pravda. His mother had been arrested in 1937. His friends and teachers had all been taken away, and he had been living in an orphanage. But, as he explains to his Western readers, who might find it strange to read about his joy on being admitted to the Komsomol, somehow I dissociated these things, and even my personal impressions and experiences, from my fundamental political conviction. It was almost as if there were two separate levels, one of everyday events and experiences which I found myself criticizing, the other that of the great party line which at this time, despite my hesitations, I still regarded as correct from the standpoint of general principle. Even at the height of the Great Terror of 1937-8, there were many believers who managed to keep their faith. They explained away the mass arrests according to the abstract formula Les rubiet shchepki letyet. When the forest is cut down, the chips will fly, or you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Believing in the march towards communism required an acceptance of its human costs. The party told its followers that they were involved in a life-or-death struggle against capitalist elements at home and abroad, which would end in the final victory of the communist utopia. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 was a crucial turning point in this struggle. It was taken as a vindication of Stalin's theory that the further the Soviet Union advanced towards communism, the greater its enemies' resistance would be. The party hardened its position, forcing skeptics to put aside their doubts and join the struggle against fascism, or run the risk of being denounced as fascist hirelings. From 1933, the purging of the party was intensified, with closer scrutiny of individual deeds to root out passive members and hidden enemies. Whole sections of society were targeted as enemies and alien elements, beginning with the remnants of the old nobility and the bourgeoisie in Leningrad, who were arrested and exiled in their thousands following the murder of the city's party boss, Sergei Kirov, in December 1934. Any group that was deemed to be a relic of the capitalist past, former kulaks, petty traders, gypsies, prostitutes, criminals, vagrants, beggars, and so on, was likely to be purged as an obstacle to the building of a communist society. Between 1932 and 1936, tens of thousands of these socially harmful elements were rounded up by the police and expelled from the towns. Most of them were sent to the Gulag. In August 1933, a brigade of 120 leading Soviet writers went on a boat tour of the White Sea Canal, organized by Semyon Firin, the Ogpu commander of the labor camps at the canal. The idea of the trip had its origins in a meeting that took place in Maxim Gorky's Moscow house in October 1932, at which a number of the country's leading writers discussed the tasks of literature with several Politburo members, including Stalin and other party functionaries. In one of the earliest statements of the socialist realist doctrine, Gorky called for a heroic literature to match the grand achievements of the 5-year plans. And Stalin, who compared the Soviet writers to engineers of the human soul, proposed a tour of the canal to inspire them. Everything was organized by Ogpu. From the minute we became the guests of the Chekists, complete communism began for us. The writer Alexander Avdeyenko later commented ironically, "We were given food and drink on demand. We paid nothing. Smoked sausage, cheeses, caviar, fruit, chocolate, wines, and cognac, all was in plentiful supply. And this was a year of famine." After staying at the luxury Astoria Hotel in Leningrad, the writers went by train to the White Sea Canal, where they inspected dams and locks and visited the cultural center to watch a theatrical performance put on by the prisoners. From the safety of their ship, they saw convicts working, but were not allowed to talk to them. To many of the writers, it was obvious that they were being presented with a sanitized version of camp life. It was evident to me that they were showing us Potemkin villages, recalled Tamara Ivanova in 1989. But if the writers had their doubts, few were brave enough to voice them at the time. During the trip, the writers had the chance to question Firin, who acted as their guide. According to Avdeyenko, the only writer who asked about the use of forced labor was Dmitry Mirsky, a former prince, Prince Dmitry Svyatopolk-Mirsky, who had fought with the White Army in the Civil War, emigrated to Britain, joined the Communists, and returned to the Soviet Union in 1932 because he believed that Stalin's Russia was going to play an enormous role in world history, and he wanted to be part of it. Mirsky's questioning made the other writers uncomfortable. He clearly had his suspicions about the reasons for the secrecy surrounding the construction of the canal. Here, at every step, there are hidden secrets, under every dam, under every lock, Mirsky told Avdeyenko, seemingly referring to the corpses buried there. But even Mirsky did not let such doubts interfere with his participation in the publication of a book commissioned by Ogpu to celebrate the completion of the canal. Edited by Firin and Gorky, the White Sea Canal was compiled at shock work speed by 36 leading Soviet writers, including Mikhail Zoshenko, Viktor Shklovsky, Alexei Tolstoy, and Valentin Kataev, together with the artist Alexandra Rodchenko, who took the photographs. The book was presented as a token of the readiness of Soviet writers to serve the cause of Bolshevism, to the delegates of the 17th Party Congress in January 1934. Though it was presented as a history of the canal's construction, the book's chief theme and propaganda message was the redemptive and liberating influence of physical labor. By taking part in the great collective work of building the canal, criminals and kulaks, it was claimed, began to feel useful to society. Through penal labor, they were remade as socialists. The writers had different reasons for colluding in this legitimation of the Gulag. No doubt there were some who believed in the Stalinist ideal of Perekovka, the remolding of the human soul through penal labor. Zhoshenko, for one, wrote a story for the White Sea Canal about a petty thief called Rottenberg, who, having lost his way in life, returns to the correct path through penal labor on the canal. As he explained in an article for Literary Leningrad, Zhoshenko believed the factual basis of his tale. I was interested in people who had built their lives on idleness, deceit, theft, and murder, and I gave all my attention to the theme of their re-education. In truth, I was quite sceptical at first, supposing that this famous reforging was simply the cynical expression of the prisoner's desire to receive freedom or bonuses, but I must say that I was mistaken on that score. I saw authentic reforging on the trip to the White Sea Canal. I saw real pride in the construction workers and noticed a real change in the psychology of many of these comrades, as they may now be called. Gorky was also a believer. He never visited the White Sea Canal, but this was no obstacle to his glowing praise of it in the book commissioned by Ogpu, just as ignorance was no obstacle to foreign socialists like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who also praised the canal as a great engineering feat, a triumph in human regeneration in 1935. Having spent the 1920s in the West, Gorky had returned to the Soviet Union on the first of several summer trips in 1928 and had settled there for good in 1931. The great Soviet writer was showered with honors. He was given as his residence the famous Ryabushinsky mansion in Moscow, 2 large dachas, private servants who turned out to be Ogpu spies, and supplies of special foods from the same police department that catered for Stalin. So, perhaps it is not surprising that Gorky failed to see the immense human suffering that lay behind the grand achievements of the 5-year plan. In the summer of 1929, Gorky had visited the Sovolyetsky labor camp. The writer was so impressed by what he was shown by his Ogpu guides that he wrote an article in which he claimed that many of the prisoners had been reformed by their labor in the camp and loved their work so much that they wanted to remain on the island after the completion of their sentences. "The conclusion is obvious to me," Gorky wrote. "We need more camps like Solovetsky." Other writers went on the trip from curiosity, as Mirsky no doubt did, or because they were afraid of the consequences if, like the writer Mikhail Bulgakov, they refused to have anything to do with the project. Viktor Shklovsky, the literary theorist and novelist whose brother was imprisoned in a labor camp, did not join the writers' brigade, but he made a separate trip to the White Sea Canal and promoted the idea of Perekovka, not just in the Ogpu volume, but in several other works. He even wrote the screenplay for a propaganda film about the White Sea Canal. It seems unlikely that Shklovsky wrote out of conviction. During his trip to the White Sea Canal, he responded to an Ogpu officer's question about how he felt to be at the canal with the quip, "like a live silver fox in a fur store." In the words of his daughter, it was just the price he had to pay for his brother's life. Shklovsky's brother was released in 1933, but in 1937 he was rearrested and disappeared forever in the Gulag. Careerist motives also played a role. They were certainly a factor for Avdayenko, an unknown writer of proletarian origins when he joined the trip to the White Sea Canal, although only 2 years later, in 1935, his first novel was critically acclaimed in the Soviet press. "The trip is how I got to the top and my life took off," Avdayenko later acknowledged. a shock worker called to literature. In one action, I joined the ranks of writers worthy of high honor in the Soviet pantheon. Avdiyenko became a regular contributor to Perikovka, the in-house OGPU NKVD journal of the labor camps at the White Sea Canal, where he wrote in praise of penal labor as a form of human reforging. Konstantin Simonov was another proletarian writer to make his name through the White Sea Canal. In 1933, he was working as a mechanic, one of the hundreds of technicians under the command of Boris Babitsky at the Mezhreb Pomfilm studios. Simonov and the other mechanics would spend their lunch breaks watching Pudovkin and Golovnia at work on the film set of The Deserter, an experience which he claimed awoke his interest in the arts. In those years, recalled Simonov, I had no proper education, but I read a lot of books, history books in particular, and for the first time in my life I tried to write. Inspired by the propaganda of the White Sea Canal, Simonov filled a notebook with bad poems about the reforging of the penal labourers, which somehow came to the attention of Gozlitystat, the state publishing house, and OGPU. Extracts from one of these poems, The White Sea Canal, were published in a collection of poetry by young Soviet writers in 1933. On the back of this success, in April 1934, Simonov applied to Gozlitystat for permission to visit the canal and collect materials about the reforging of its convict labourers for a collection of poetry in praise of the labour camps. Gozlitystat approved the trip and paid for Simonov to spend a month at the Medvezhegorsk labour camp on the White Sea Canal, where he was employed as a journalist by Perikovka. He lived in the barracks with a team of prisoners who did not take the 19-year-old poet very seriously. They laughed at me when I told them I was writing a poem about the White Sea Canal. For this reason, it seemed to Simonov, the prisoners were relatively natural with me. By the early summer of 1934, the construction of the White Sea Canal had been largely completed. The labourers observed by Simonov were engaged in building roads and installations, relatively easy tasks compared with the heavy manual digging of the main canal in 1931-3, when tens of thousands died. As the project came to an end, the camp administration rewarded labourers with bonuses, honours and medals. It also granted early release orders to some of the petty criminals who made up the workforce on the part of the canal visited by Simonov. The main aim of these rewards was to fulfill the myth of Perikovka. They gave the prisoners an incentive to work hard and reform themselves, or give the impression that they were reformed, in order to gain their freedom or material advantages. Simonov was taken in. He was young and innocent. As he recalled in his memoirs, he returned from the White Sea Canal ready to write new poetry about the reforging of people through labour. Even though I had not been there long, I was convinced that I had seen with my own eyes how that reforging was actually taking place, as I believed it should. For what else but labour can redeem a person's sins in a society such as ours? Simonov was particularly impressed by a story he had been told about an engineer, a close associate of the provisional government, practically the last commandant of the Winter Palace, who was sentenced to 8, if not 10 years under Article 58, and worked so well in his capacity as an engineer on the White Sea Canal that he was released after just 3 years. He then worked voluntarily as the chief engineer on a construction site connected to the Moscow-Volga Canal. That kind of story was reinforced by my own impressions from my journey. It is possible that Simonov was thinking here of Pyotr Palchinsky, 1875 to 1929, the mining engineer whom Kerensky placed in command of the Winter Palace in October 1917. Imprisoned by the Bolsheviks, Palchinsky was released and subsequently allowed to resume his work at the Russian Technical Institute during the 1920s. He was rearrested in 1928 and executed the next year. There were many camp legends about famous prisoners like Palchinsky. and it seems that Simonov was taken in by one of them. In reality, the willingness of certain specialists to go on working in the Gulag system after their release was seldom the result of reforging, but Simonov believed that what he saw at the White Sea Canal matched the stories he had heard or had read in the Soviet press. "In my perception," Simonov recalled in his memoirs, "the White Sea Canal was not just about the construction of a canal, but a humanitarian school for the reconstruction of bad people into good, of common criminals into builders of the 5-year plan." For Simonov, a nobleman involved in the reconstruction of his own identity as a proletarian writer, the idea of Perekovka had a special resonance. In his memoirs, Simonov recounts how he perceived the reforging of the kulaks and bourgeois saboteurs as highly promising for society, and as an inspiration for himself, because it showed the possibility of burying the past and moving on to a new path. The reforging of the former oppositionists at the 17th Party Conference, the Congress of Victors, in 1934, was another inspiration to the young writer as he strove to make a career for himself in an artistic sphere that was so tightly supervised by the party. At that Congress, several party leaders who had been opposed to Stalin's extreme policies, Bukharin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Rykov, Tomsky, Pyatakov, and others, were allowed to speak. They recanted their old positions and heaped praise on Stalin in the name of party unity, and they were received in a manner that suggested that the party leadership had rehabilitated them. Simonov took comfort from their example. As he saw it, the reception of the repentant oppositionists proved that the party was a place where people like himself might receive forgiveness for their past. Simonov understood that his own reforging would depend on the reconstruction of his political personality. Like the former oppositionists, he had to show that he was a worthy communist by renouncing his own past. His writings on the White Sea Canal were the means to that end. After he returned from the canal, Simonov applied for a second time to join the Komsomol. On the previous occasion, following the arrest of his stepfather in 1931, he had been advised to withdraw his application, but this time he was invited to join. This acceptance was a huge relief for Simonov. In his memoirs, he remembers 1934 as the high point of his hopes in the future. "I cannot speak for other people of my age, but for me, 1934 was the year of brightest hope in all my youth. There was a sense that the country had come through a difficult period and that, although problems still remained, life was becoming easier in both spiritual and material terms. I was happy to be taking part in the building of this new life. The correctness of Stalin, who was leading the industrialization of the country and achieving great success, seemed indisputable to me. As I saw it, he was right to argue with his opponents and to show that they were wrong." In the summer of 1934, shortly after his return, Simonov wrote a poem, Horizon, about the reforging of a criminal in the labor camps. The poem was heavily edited and in places censored by the Cultural Educational Department of OGPU, which concluded that the poem was very badly written, pretentious, clumsy, cacophonous, mechanical, and sentimentalized, but worthy of publication for its propaganda value nonetheless. Horizon was reworked by Simonov and eventually published as Pavel Chyorny in 1938. In later years, Simonov would look back at this poem with feelings of horror. He insisted on excluding it from all collections of his published works, but the poem was the making of Simonov's career. It demonstrated his ability to turn out poetry that could be used by the Stalinist regime. Simonov was encouraged to apply to the Gorky Literary Institute. He was even given a recommendation by his political patrons in Gozlitistad and the Cultural Educational Department of OGPU. Located in the former Herzien Palace in the Tver Boulevard, the Literary Institute was opened in 1933 to encourage writers from the working class. Until 1936, it was called the Workers' Evening Literary University. Classes took place in the evening, which allowed Simonov to continue with his job at Mezhrabpomfilm and supplement his 200-ruble grant. Most of the students at the Literary Institute were not from the working class at all. They had been born to noble or bourgeois families and, like Simonov, had qualified for entry to the institute by going through a factory school or by working in a factory. Half the students were members of the Komsomol or the party. The institute was a cosmopolitan place with writers from 27 different nationalities. Among the many Jewish students were two young women who would become Simonov's first wives, Natalia Tiput, the daughter of a well-known variety theatre man who married Simonov in 1935, and Zhenya Laskina, the youngest daughter of the ruined Nepman Samuil Laskin, who joined the institute in 1936 and married Simonov in 1939. By his own admission, Simonov had no special affinity for literature. It was a career he pursued because of his spoilt biography. "If it were not for my noble origins," he had told Natalia, "I would not have been interested in literature at all, only in politics and history." Nor was Simonov considered to be among the most talented students at the Literary Institute. In 1936, he was ranked 7th in a list of excellence, headed by the poet Margarita Alliger. But he was known as a conscientious student who was well organized. He carefully planned out the time he spent on working, reading, even socializing, and always punctual in completing his tasks. His fellow students nicknamed Simonov the Iron Bottom because he worked so hard. "He just sat down and wrote," recalls the poet Yevgeny Dolmatovsky, who came in second on the list of excellence. Alliger remembers Simonov as someone who stood out as a leader from the start. Usually dressed in a leather jacket like the Bolsheviks in the Civil War, or in a jacket, shirt and tie, Simonov distanced himself from the bohemian culture of the other students at the institute, spending his spare time in Komsomol activities or writing book reviews rather than in playing billiards. Not surprisingly, he was held in high regard by the administration of the institute, which saw him as a party loyalist and entrusted him with many tasks. In 1937, he would play a leading role in the denunciation of anti-Soviet elements within the institute. Simonov was serious and censorious, more like a literary bureaucrat than a young poet. "Not having written my own book," he recalled in 1945, "I wrote many critical reviews of books written by others. I was very strict and impatient." Which just goes to show that the most crudely negative reviews of a book are always written by reviewers who have not succeeded or could not succeed in writing such a book themselves. As a poet at the Institute, Simonov was learning how to write for his political superiors. The theme of Berikovka, which became a commonplace of the socialist realist tradition in the 1930s, reappeared in several of his early poems, which returned to the subject of the White Sea Canal. But increasingly his poetry was shaped by the hopes of the 5-year plans and by the heroic theme of struggle epitomized by the Spanish Civil War. Here, Simonov was deeply influenced by his poetry teacher Vladimir Lugovskoy, 1901–57, a charismatic figure to the young poets at the Institute, whose room was filled with swords and guns, memorabilia from his fighting days in the Russian Civil War and the last campaign against the Basmachi Muslim rebels in Central Asia in 1931. Simonov explored the theme of masculinity and heroic courage in poems like The General, which was inspired by the death of the Hungarian communist Mate Zalka, also known as General Lukács, in the Spanish Civil War. For Simonov, who took his basic values from the military ethos of his stepfather, the bravery and self-sacrifice of fighters such as Zalka were not just wonderful human qualities, but virtues of the first necessity in a world engulfed by the struggle between socialism and fascism. As Simonov explained to a foreign journalist in 1960, "We young communists of the 1930s hated with a passion anyone who showed signs of complacency by imagining that our future victory would be easy and bloodless." This was a generation immersed in the notion of struggle, a generation that lived in readiness for war. Recalling his student years, Simonov was speaking for a whole epoch when he wrote in 1973, "The Literary Institute opened the same year the Nazis came to power. All our years of study were overshadowed by the sense of an impending war with fascism. These were years when it was impossible to think of literature and one's path in it without thinking how, sooner or later, we too would be forced to play a part, whether with a pen or a rifle in our hands was not yet clear, in this looming struggle with fascism." On the 1st of January 1936, Simonov had his first poem published in Izvestia, New Year's Toast. It was an early sign of the favour with which the young poet, then just 20 years of age, would come to be regarded by the party leadership. In the poem, Simonov conjured up the idea of a final struggle between light and dark. "Friends, today we stand on high alert. Wolves encircle our republic. So we raise our glasses and drink in silence to those who stand by the machine gun, to those whose only friend is the rifle, to everyone who knows the verb to fight, a sad verb that we need to know, to those who can leave a silent room and walk into the unknown fire." At the same time as Simonov was making his career, his 3 Obolensky aunts were languishing in exile in Orenburg, a city on the eastern Volga steppes, 1,500 kilometers southeast of Moscow, having been expelled from Leningrad in the repressions that followed the murder of Kirov. Simonov was fond of his 3 aunts. He had written to them regularly since he was a child. Lyudmila, the eldest of his mother's 3 sisters, had married an artillery captain from a family of Russified Germans, Maximilian Tiedemann. His death in the First World War had left Lyudmila and her 3 children stranded in Ryazan, where Maximilian's regiment had been based. After returning to Petrograd in 1922, Lyudmila worked as a teacher in a school for handicapped children. By the time of her arrest in 1935, her 3 children had grown up. 2 went with her to Orenburg, but her eldest son remained in Leningrad, where he was highly valued as a manager at the Red Triangle factory, which helped to protect him from arrest. Daria, or Dolly, the middle sister, was severely handicapped, the left side of her body deformed and paralyzed, which made it hard for her to move. Personal misfortune had turned her into a cantankerous old maid. Dogmatically religious, she made no secret of her hatred of the Soviet regime and clung to the traditions of the aristocracy. In 1927, Dolly came to visit Alexandra in Ryazan. There were constant arguments about religion, which, claims Simonov, led him to become an atheist, although in his later letters to his aunts, Simonov continued to express religious sentiments. Simonov visited Dolly in Leningrad on several occasions, but he thought of it as a duty call. He much preferred Sonia, his 3rd and youngest aunt, with whom he often stayed in Leningrad. Sonia was a plump woman with a round face and a kind smile, which reflected, as Simonov recalls, her simple good nature and openness. Unlike Dolly, Sonia adapted to the Soviet system, although her manners, values, and beliefs retained traces of the 19th century culture of the aristocracy. Trained as a teacher, she worked as a librarian and lived alone in a large room in a communal apartment. But she was not bitter or unhappy with her lot. On the contrary, Simonov recalls her as the liveliest and most fun of all his aunts. Not having children of her own, she loved to have her nephews and her nieces stay with her. She had a soft spot for Konstantin, her youngest nephew, whose interest in books she helped to stimulate. "My dear, darling Kiryushonchik," she wrote to Simonov, "I hope that you grow up to become useful and a comfort to us all, who love you so dearly. I hope that you will always have enough to eat, as we had in olden times." The last time Simonov saw Sonia was in the autumn of 1933, when he stayed with her in Leningrad. He wrote his first poems in her room. In February 1935, Sonia was exiled with Lyudmila and Dolly to Orenburg. Simonov recalls his mother's reaction when she found out, in Moscow, that her 3 sisters had been sent into exile, along with many other people she had known since her childhood in St. Petersburg. She sat there in tears with the letters she had just received from Orenburg, and suddenly she said, "If I had returned then with Lyudmila, from Ryazan to Petrograd, I would be together with them now, of course." I remember being shocked by the way she said these words. She spoke with some sort of guilt that she was not with them, that she had somehow managed to escape the ordeal that afflicted her sisters. Then she asked my stepfather, "Maybe we will be exiled from here?" When she said "we," she was not talking about the family. She meant herself, her origins, the Obolensky clan. Simonov does not explain why he was so shocked. Perhaps he was surprised by his mother's expression of guilt, but there was something else besides. Simonov had been brought up to think of himself as a Soviet person. Even the arrest of his stepfather had failed to shake him from this view. On the contrary, it had reinforced his striving to fashion for himself a proletarian identity. All his efforts to recast himself, first as an engineer and then as a proletarian writer, had strengthened his identification with the Soviet system. But his mother's response to the arrest of his aunts, which was, it seems, the first time that he had heard her identify herself as a social alien in Soviet terms, forced him to confront reality. Simonov's mother and stepfather sent monthly packages of food and clothes to Orenburg, and he himself put aside a part of his own earnings to help with these parcels. In 1936, Alexandra visited her 3 sisters. As Simonov recalls, she was afraid that she might not return. Many people feared that they would be arrested if they visited their exiled relatives. Simonov's stepfather, always practical, thought it would be better if she did not go, because if she was arrested, it would be even harder to help her 3 sisters. But Alexandra insisted on going, because, as she said, if she did not, she would cease to be herself. On her return from Orenburg, Alexandra was exhausted, sad, worn out from the long journey and the terrible conditions there, recalls Simonov. But she was not without hope for the future, because she thought that nothing worse could happen to them now. But worse was to come. In 1937, Sonia and Dolly were arrested and imprisoned in Orenburg. Sonia was shot, and Dolly later died in a labor camp. Only Lyudmila survived. Looking back on these events in the last year of his life, Simonov recalled his reaction to the death of his favorite aunt. "When I found out that she had been imprisoned, and then we ceased to hear from her, and then they told us that she had died, although not where or how, I remember experiencing this strong and painful feeling of injustice that was related entirely to her, Sonia, or most of all to her. The feeling would not leave my soul. I am not afraid to say this, and it stayed forever in my memory as the main injustice committed by the state, by Soviet power, against myself personally. The feeling is particularly bitter because I know that, had Sonia been alive, she would have been the first person I would have helped when I was in a position to do so. Simonov's regret was based on the awareness he gained in later years. the awareness that he had colluded in the system of repression that destroyed his aunts. Yet, as he admits in his memoirs, at the time of their arrest, his reaction had been different. He felt sorry for his aunts, but he found a way to rationalize and perhaps even justify their fates. I cannot remember what I thought about it then, in 1937, how I judged and explained to myself what had happened. I know that I could not have been unaffected, if only because I loved one of my aunts, Sonia, very much. But perhaps I thought, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. This acceptance seems much more cynical today than it felt then, when the revolution, the breaking up of the old society, was still not so distant in people's memories, and when it was rare to have a conversation without recourse to that phrase. If Simonov's encounter with the White Sea Canal brought him closer to the regime, for others it had the opposite effect. In 1929, Ilya Slavin, the former Zionist and a leading jurist at the Institute of Soviet Law in Moscow, was transferred to Leningrad to bolster the legal department of the Communist Academy. During the purges of that year, the law department of Leningrad University had been closed down and its bourgeois academics expelled. The legal department of the Communist Academy, which replaced it, was deemed in need of trusted Bolsheviks like Slavin to strengthen its resolve against the bourgeois rightists of the Soviet legal world, whose presence was still felt in Leningrad. Slavin had become a major figure in the field of Soviet law. An advisor to the Commissariat of Justice, he was also a member of the commission that had written the Soviet Criminal Code of 1926, the first major overhaul of criminal law since 1917. In Leningrad, the Slavins had 2 rooms in a large apartment which they shared with another family. In Moscow, they had lived in a communal apartment shared by 15 families. Eventually, they moved to a 3-room flat in the house of the Leningrad Soviet, where many government workers, scientists, and artists lived. We were relatively privileged, recalls Ilya's daughter, Ida Slavina. My brother and his wife had their own room. My parents had another, where my father also worked, and I slept in the dining room. When there were guests, I went to sleep in my parents' room, and then was moved to the divan in the dining room when my parents went to bed. But there was no hint of luxury. It was a Spartan, almost puritanical way of life, entirely dedicated to the socialist ideals of my father. We shared our extra rations, of which my father was ashamed, with our poorer friends and relatives. Books were our only luxury. Slavin served his political patrons with a violent attack on the bourgeois tendencies of a number of leading Soviet jurists in a book commissioned by the Communist Academy as part of the regime's purge of the legal academic establishment in 1931. In this short but poisonous text, Sabotage on the Front of Soviet Criminal Law, Slavin compared the writings of several leading academic lawyers in the 1920s with their writings before 1917 in order to expose what he claimed were their real but concealed bourgeois views. Writing from political conviction in the belief that the old legal thinking needed to be rooted out, Slavin denounced these jurists for attempting to subvert the basic ideological tenets of the Soviet legal system. He singled out for criticism the former law department at Leningrad University, which, he maintained, had been training yesterday's priests and white guardists to pose as the Marxists of today and the communists of tomorrow. Several of the jurists Slavin attacked were subsequently removed from their posts in the universities of Leningrad and Moscow, and forced to look for work in the provinces. In the Slavin family archive there is a photograph of Ilya Slavin with his fellow teachers and some students at the Communist Academy in 1931. On the back it is inscribed, "To Comrade Slavin, in fond memory of you as a firm communist of the Bolshevik Guard, as our teacher, as a steadfast fighter on the ideological front, an iron broom purging vermin from the academic heights. For Ida Slavina, it is hard to reconcile this description with her memory of her father as a soft and tender man. Perhaps Slavin was sucked into the system of repression because he was too weak to resist the demands of the party. Maybe he felt vulnerable because of his previous involvement in the Zionist movement, and wrote the book to prove his worthiness as a member of the Bolshevik Guard. Or perhaps, as Ida thinks, he lost his way because he was misled by his beliefs. Slavin believed in Perekhovka. Before 1917, he had carried out experiments in reforging by setting up a workshop and a cultural centre for the prisoners of a local jail in Mogilev, where he worked as a legal assistant and was acquainted with the prison governor. The idea of reforging surfaced in many of his legal writings in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in his articles on the idea of comrade courts, tovarisheskие sudi, tribunals at the workplace, in which he argued for the use of penal labour as a form of community service to reform the prisoner. In 1933, Slavin was given a new task by the leadership of the Communist Academy to write a book provisionally entitled The Reforging of Penal Labourers as Exemplified by the White Sea Canal. In essence, he was asked to come up with a legal and philosophical justification for the Gulag labour camps. Perhaps Slavin's previous writings on reforging played a role in earning him this dreadful commission, but the main reason why he had been chosen was because he had already shown through sabotage on the front of Soviet criminal law that he was prepared to construct legal arguments for the regime's system of repression. To believe in Perekhovka was one thing, to see it in action another. In 1932-3, Slavin made several trips to the White Sea Canal and to other sites of penal labour, including the Moscow-Volga Canal and the Kolyma labour camps in northeast Siberia. What he saw there destroyed his belief in the Soviet ideal of reforging. Ida recalls how her father returned from these trips exhausted and depressed, how he would not talk to anyone for several days, as if he was living in a state of shock. Slavin was particularly shaken by his visit to a children's labour colony, where he was alarmed by the brutal discipline that was used by the guards to reforge the children in the Soviet spirit. Slavin could not bring himself to write the book on the White Sea Canal. For several years he postponed its completion. A number of draft chapters were torn up, one of them entitled Fascist Distortions in the Policy of Reforging, as he came to realize that there was no Perekhovka in the camps. Slavin knew he was trapped. After the murder of Kirov, when half the staff were purged from the Communist Academy, Slavin feared that he would be arrested too. Ida recalls her parents locking themselves in their room. They sat up talking, whispering all night. The party archives confirm that in December 1934, Slavin's name was added to a list of political suspects to be arrested at a future date, who had left other parties to join the Bolsheviks. Under growing pressure from the leaders of the Communist Academy, Slavin submitted some draft chapters of the book on the White Sea Canal. In these chapters, Slavin offered a number of criticisms of the daily workings of the Gulag system, but made no reference to the policy of reforging, of which he had seen no evidence. The chapter he had once called Fascist Distortions now appeared as Distortions in the Policy of Reforging. It was a courageous act, for which Slavin was sharply criticized by the editorial commission of the Communist Academy in May 1935. That event was a moral turning point. Sensing that he could no longer hold to his Bolshevik beliefs, he renewed his old contacts with the Zionists, a desperate attempt, in Ida's words, to put the clock back and make up for his political mistakes. But Slavin must have known that it was too late. He was in a hopeless situation. Completing the book on Perikovka might have saved him, but he could not do this morally, so he kept putting it off, surely aware that the longer he delayed, the closer he was moving to his own arrest. "I am finished," Slavin told a meeting of his party comrades at the Communist Academy in March 1937. "I am a political bankrupt."